these last two games of the quadrilogy are going to be tough to tackle. Super Metroid and Fusion are easily the entries I have the most experience with of the 2D lineup. I'm going to try my damnedest to keep this as unbiased as possible, but that's gonna be kinda difficult seeing how Metroid 2 just kinda rocked my world recently. I mean, just damn, that game is good. I was actually curious going into Super how my opinion on the game may have changed as a result of my playthrough of Metroid 2, so this video will likely be more a direct comparison between 2 and Super's design philosophy. I guess the best place to start is the story, since there is actual context to what you're playing in-game beyond stuff you extrapolate through gameplay and world design. The game begins with a recap of the plot of the last two games, cutting to the core of those stories. Metroid 1 is summed up as an assault on a space pirate base on Zebes and the destruction of Mother Brain, and Metroid 2 as the eradication of the Metroid species. It's rather convenient that each of the previous game's stories can be summed up in a sentence. I'm uncertain how necessary it was. If I had to guess, I'd wager the inclusion of this introduction is solely for those that either didn't finish Metroid 1 because it was obnoxiously difficult, or Metroid 2 because it was weirdly obscure and evidently not very popular, and with this being a direct sequel capitalizing on the plots of both of those previous entries, the greater context was likely seen by the developers as a necessity. Now, the reason I'm uncertain about whether this intro is necessary or not is because a lot of the plot isn't needed to understand what's going on. The game could wordlessly throw you into the starting level and world map and you'd still get the gist of things. Let's start with the title screen, just like before. I honestly can't complain about the title this time. Super Metroid is pretty standard naming for the SNES era. Super Mario, Super Castlevania, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Zelda. What? That's not a thing? Yeah, well, you get the point. It could be indicative that this game is a sequel or an improved remake of the original, and it's kinda both. I'll explain that in a minute. Super Metroid. The reason this title screen works far better than the first two games is that it's immediately establishing several things about the game that you need to know without saying a word. Well, it says two things, but you get my point. The first thing you see on screen is a Metroid, and a bunch of dead people lying about. This immediately makes it clear what a Metroid is, something the series hasn't clearly established at this point outside of the guidebooks. It also establishes how dangerous they are, or how dangerous the circumstances around them may be. Ignoring the game's direct exposition, the game sends you straight into the location shown in the title screen, the space station Ceres. You come across the very scene from the title screen, but with something missing. I wonder where... Oh. Now, this bit is kinda brilliant. It does a good job at establishing an antagonist. You can infer that the Metroid is a dangerous creature. All the more so seeing how it's being kidnapped by a fucking space pterodactyl that breathes fire. In space! It makes it clear that the Metroid is a threat and that this thing is a bigger threat because it is stealing it. It knows what it's for, or at least what it intends to do with it, you can assume. It flies off and you make chase to planet Zebes from the first game, and thus the game begins proper. It's hard to knock this intro. I think it has a fair bit of unnecessary exposition for establishing its premise, but it's by far the most effective in giving you a motivation and goal than the previous two entries, which just dropped you into the world with little to go off of, other than hearsay or poorly translated attract mode screens. With or without the exposition, this intro is just excellent, and doesn't outstay its welcome. And before anyone says anything, yes, I know the space pterodactyl is named Ridley. I've played this shit before. I'm just trying to get myself in the mindset of a newcomer that wouldn't have had internet or maybe even a guidebook at the time when this came out. In case the game hadn't made it clear why you go to Zebes when Ridley flies off, there's a statue featuring Ridley amongst the other bosses you'll be encountering, which indicates that he has some presence on the planet, and that you probably pursued him. That said, there is one thing that bothers me about the story. Why Zebes? I mean, Samus destroyed their base here already. Wouldn't it make more sense for them to build a base somewhere that Samus wouldn't already be familiar with, so she'd lose her home field advantage? Just strikes me as a bit odd. If I had to speculate, I'd say it's because this was originally intended to be a remake rather than a sequel during development. This is why I said it felt more like both a sequel and a remake of the original. It's basically just a bigger, better Metroid 1, ignoring the story, and really, that's the only thing that makes this game feel like a sequel in the first place. That said, I guess it's about time we got onto the world design. And I'm gonna be honest, the visual storytelling in this game is vastly inferior compared to Metroid 2, strangely. At least beyond the intro. Well, that's not entirely true. There are outliers like the derelict ship or the new Turian. And before I dig into those, for those unaware, Turian is the final area of the first game where you fight Mother Brain and the Metroids. They actually do show it in the game's intro sequence, but I figured I'd explain it anyway. That said, there is one thing that bothers me about the old Turian in this game. You remember that rather iconic starting room from the original Metroid? Apparently that's directly below the original Turian via the elevator. So, why do we have to go through everything in Metroid 1? How did Samus get to that room without running into Mother Brain? I need answers! Joking aside, the derelict ship and new Turian are pretty legit with environmental storytelling. The derelict ship is pretty self-explanatory. It's a spooky, possibly crashed spacefaring vessel inhabited by a ghost alien thing called Phantoon, who seems to be leeching the power from the ship. It's also not entirely clear where this ship came from or who it belonged to. Given the presence of Chozo statues, it could be the remains of a Chozo ship, or perhaps a ship researching the Chozo? But I suppose that question is part of the charm. Turian, on the other hand, takes a more direct approach to visual storytelling. I won't spoil the major story moments for those of you who haven't played, but this is naturally where you run into the baby Metroid again from the beginning, and in the run-up to it you come across the husks of other creatures that had been drained by a Metroid. In the second game, as good as it was with visual storytelling, they didn't communicate entirely well what exactly Metroids were capable of. But now you can see the impact they have on their environments, which makes the following encounter all the more daunting. But I'll leave that for you to discover for yourself. It's certainly not because the footage corrupted and I don't feel like re-recording everything. Now, the reason I think the world's visual storytelling is weaker than Metroid 2 is because most of the environments are just biomes that don't serve the world building, so much as the atmosphere and the enemy variety. That doesn't mean they're bad by any stretch. They're still great to look at and distinctly alien in appearance, but it doesn't tell you anything about the history. The placement of the save rooms and Chozo statues seems more for convenience than for cohesion. To the game's credit, the world is structured in such a way that it guides you effectively to wherever it wants you to be via cleverly placed one-way routes and tantalizing locked doors littered along a path that you came down to get a related power-up. But because of this, it feels like everything was designed for your convenience rather than for the sake of proper world building. I think this is largely a consequence of building this off the base the first game set. Again, with this game likely having started as a pseudo-remake like I mentioned earlier. But again, that's just me speculating. I'm well aware Zero Mission exists. I just can't shake the thought that this was originally intended to be a remake like Super Castlevania was to Castlevania 1. Sorry I keep bringing that up, I'll move on. Environmental storytelling aside, I do think the world structure is very well handled. Unlike the more linear approach to world design the second game had, Super Metroid takes a pseudo-open world approach, where the different parts of the world weave in and out of one another. And while I think they lack narrative cohesion, the design philosophy does make the world feel more like an actual ecosystem. It's not really a drawback or anything, but a result of this is that it fails to deliver on the same dread the second game built up with your perilous descent towards the bottom of a cave system. Super, on the other hand, has you return to the surface on multiple occasions to progress. The unfortunate downside to this change in design philosophy, at least in my eyes, is that it came at the cost of strong level design and telegraphing of secrets that the first game had. This is where Video Game Donkey's Metroid bullshit became far more prominent. In Metroid 2, the environments were often cleverly designed in such a way that you'd know a secret was nearby if you just had sharp eyes for level geography and texture work. But in Super, it mostly comes down to, is there a dot on the map? Guess I better bomb the hell out of every wall imaginable till I find it. Or use the scan visor, I guess. There are outliers to this, of course. Mission-critical upgrades are usually heavily projected on the way through the map as it guides you around, or they're located immediately after a boss encounter, so there's zero chance of missing them. But on the search for power-ups, it basically comes down to whether or not you want to bother searching for them. I'd wager a good third of the power-ups in the game are behind locked doors rather than breakable blocks, but that still leaves 2/3 of the hidden secrets behind Metroid bullshit. And that's kinda a shame. I can agree that there's a lot of fun in a collectathon when it challenges you to find the items yourself, but if your only hint is poorly implemented scanning systems and map dots, rather than intuitive level design and texture work, there's something clearly wrong. Moving on to gameplay, I honestly think this game might actually control worse than its Game Boy predecessor. The feel of the physics is largely the same as Metroid 2. It's once again not bad, but it leaves a lot to be desired in precision platforming, and this is a rather troublesome development. Where they could have ironed out the controls, they instead opted to bloat the controls further with new additions such as super missiles and power bombs, which, while cool conceptually, take away from the simple light switch approach to missiles that the previous two entries had, and only act as keys to doors and damage buffs rather than a substantial form of progression that the previous games added, like the space jump. Which reminds me, the space jump in this game at least handles better than Metroid 2. I'm honestly not sure whether that's a good thing or not, since it kinda breaks some of the level design due to its ease of use, but I suppose it's less frustrating than dropping out of the sky several stories after a single mistake, which was a slight problem I had with it in the second game. More pressing is the grapple beam, which just handles like ass. The idea of swinging from a rope, or beam, isn't exactly a novel concept, and I personally don't think I've seen it implemented well in a 2D platforming game to date, at least that I played. It's also yet another ability that takes up slots alongside super missiles, power bombs, and the scan visor, adding yet more complication to the light switch approach to power-ups, and with even less substance, as this power-up both inconveniences you by taking away your reliable fighting method and lacks utility through most of the game. Now, this next quirk of the controls is a bit more debatable as to whether or not it was a good or bad decision. The ability to aim diagonally. I'm all for adding more versatility to Samus's basic capabilities, and in general I think the ability to aim in more directions is a welcome one, but for seemingly no rhyme or reason, aiming diagonally up or aiming diagonally down are mapped to L and R respectively. In some ways, I see this as a good thing, since it allows you to aim the way you want at the press of a button, but on the other hand, it also takes up yet more buttons, and I think this is at least part of the reason why all the power-ups got muddled up under the weapon selection. Beam upgrades, on the other hand, are actually handled remarkably well compared to everything else. They stack. Well, most of them do, and it's awesome. Unlike Metroid 2, where you could only equip one beam at a time, this allows you to feel like you're actually growing as a player, rather than it being a simple damage buff. They actually feature effects that are immediately tangible. The Spazer Beam allows you to fire 3 beams at once. The Wave Beam does the same thing, but it also goes through walls. The Ice Beam turns enemies into platforms to jump on, and the Plasma Beam can fire through multiple enemies at once. Sure, these all add to your beam's strength as well, but the extra features attached to each one makes it feel far more meaningful. Alright, and the bosses are a bit toss. I don't feel the need to substantiate that right now, since I'll be talking about those in a later video, so just stick with me for that. So, is this game a masterpiece? Yeah, maybe. While I personally got more enjoyment out of playing through Metroid 2, revisiting Super again did remind me why I liked the game so much in the first place. Is it my favorite? Nah. Among the 2D entries, I still enjoy Fusion and 2 more, but it's definitely up there, and I can still recommend this wholeheartedly. There was a time when this was my favorite 2D entry in the series, but as time has passed, my opinion has changed. So I hope you'll join me next time when we dive into Metroid Fusion. I hope this video lit a fire under ya, and that you have a fantastic night.